Whenever you want to talk about brilliant minds that helped move us forward, that were forward thinkers, that thought about these concepts and innovated these ideas, coined new terms that would forever influence a field, you have to talk about Dr. Sigmund Freud. Now, I don't think he gets enough appreciation. I really don't. I feel like for people who, most people I think fall in these two categories. Either one, you've never heard of him, or if you've heard of him, you're like, oh yeah, that white old psychology guy, he said something about unconscious, something about sex, something about wanting to sleep with your parents, like that dude. Here's the really strange thing that we're in, and I think this is so unfair to criticize. What we do is we look at someone, okay, with their concepts and their ideas, and we judge them from today's perspective. So in 2022, I look at what he's saying and I go, yeah, that's obvious. The problem is you have to take yourself back. This is not a hyperbole. This is not an exaggeration. 120 years ago, it's the year 1902, all right? When Dr. Sigmund Freud comes out and he starts saying these things for the first time, it's damn near revolutionary. Look, if we're talking right now, and I say, you tell me, Dana, what kind of a person is John? I say, John is very extroverted. You know exactly what I mean. But when Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung comes out and he uses that word for the first time ever and says extroversion means this, introversion means this, there's a scale. It's mind-blowing. And the fact that we still use that terminology to this date is crazy. Like it's actually unbelievable. So whenever we talk about Sigmund Freud and these other historical figures, it's really important to look at them in the times that they were in. And Sigmund Freud was late 1800s to about early 1900s. I want to say he died around 1930s, if I'm not mistaken. And the work that he did it's actually unbelievable. Like, if you look at the influence that he himself had with his theory of psychoanalysis and the way that that's impacted psychology to this day in 2022, it's unfreaking believable. One last example, because I really want to push this home. Last night I was watching one of Bruce Lee's most senior students. His name is Dan Inosanto, I believe that's how it's pronounced. And he was showing this drill to former UFC fighter Anderson Silva. And he's throwing jabs, he's throwing hooks, and he's going for a takedown of sorts. If you're watching that with 2022 vision, you're going, so what? The problem is you got to think about when Bruce Lee was teaching this stuff. If the year is 1973, okay? And if you're being taught this stuff, that's 20 years before the UFC. You are 20 years ahead of the whole mixed martial arts movement, saying we got to combine boxing, we got to combine the knees from Muay Thai, we have to combine wrestling takedowns. And when you're the first person to take a step, folks, it's a really big step. So, to go back to Sigmund Freud and just his absolute brilliance, you had a person who was a medical doctor who ended up helping people by talking. They would call him, they said, Dr. Freud has come up with talking medicine. He has the talking medicine. And which is interestingly enough, is the majority of his clients, the majority of his patients were women at the time. So a woman would report going to Dr. Sigmund Freud with physical symptoms, sick to the stomach, nauseous, lightheadedness, tenseness, headaches. They would go to him and they'd come back feeling completely better. When their family and friends asked, what kind of medicine did he give you? What did he prescribe you? They say, well, he didn't prescribe me anything. We just talked. Now again, for the time, this is unbelievable because you have real physical symptoms and he talked to you and those physical symptoms were all resolved. How is that possible? We know now in 2022 that a lot of these mental health problems, they have physical complications. We know that an immense amount of stress can lead to tightness in your neck, in your upper back, and can even lead to headaches. We know that anxiety can lead to things like nausea. We know that being scared or being shocked or something really unexpected can drop your blood pressure levels, making you feel faint and lightheaded. So we understand that there are some of these mental health components that have physical aspects to them. And what was happening was he was becoming famous, if you will, using talk therapy in order to help these patients relieve their problems. Now, he offered a plethora of things to the world of psychology, and Dr. Freud oftentimes gets looked at like this. Imagine you have someone who comes out and makes 8 statements publicly. He comes out and says 8 different things. Over time, you find out 6 of them are true, 7 of them are true. The problem is we focus on the one that isn't true. We say, you said that one thing wrong that one night. Like, yeah, man, but he said 7 other things that were completely true. Freud was one of the first people to really head-on spear this idea of the unconscious. This idea of how can you drive and you start thinking about the argument that you had with your girlfriend, and all of a sudden when you snap back to it, you're 2 blocks down where you thought you were. You're going, wait, did I already pass that intersection? I did. How is that possible? Did I teleport? No. How was I driving? How did I follow the law? How didn't I run a red light? I didn't even realize I was still driving. How is that possible? How does that happen? When you go reach for a glass of water, are you thinking specifically, I'm going to reach this cup, I'm going to bring my hand closer to me, I'm going to close the cupboard, I'm going to put it in the sink, I'm going to open up the tap? You don't think. You're thinking about dinner, you're thinking about a test, you're thinking about your girlfriend. So these are all just these other mechanics. So this idea that he created was, he goes, look, we have this unconscious, and there are several different processes that happen behind the scenes that help govern us. Now, if you're interested in this, you can type in Sigmund Freud, id, ego, and superego. It's going to go more in depth about it. My perspective is this: I'm really a fan of the practicality. So I want to strip away all the fat, all the extra stuff for theory, and I want to talk about the things that we still use today. So scientists, after many, many years, after Freud proposed this stuff, for which many called him crazy, we came out and we confirmed many of this stuff. Even though right now, if you open our brain, you're not going to see a specific brain part titled the id, the ego, and the superego. However, this idea that he had where he goes, look, different parts of the brain are responsible for different areas. That was right. He was right. We have our frontal lobe responsible for judgments and decision making. We have our occipital lobe, knowing that our vision is controlled from there. We have all these different parts of our brain that control slightly different things, whether it's controlling our emotion, whether it's controlling our nervous system. Like there's a specific part of the brain that releases hormones that tell us when to go into fight or flight or not. So there are many things that he said that were right. Another big one is this. When you look at grief, something that's been popularized in the last couple of years has been the 5 stages of grief. So people will say, oh, you know, when you're grieving, you go through a couple of these stages. Guess what the first stage is? Denial. Who came up with denial? Dr. Sigmund Freud. In the 1900s, he said, look, we have, and he introduced the word, defense mechanisms. We want to try to protect ourselves from feeling pain. And he understood that if we feel pain emotionally, it can also impact us physically, like he had learned with his patients. So he goes, look, our body naturally, or our mind, has these defense mechanisms which are implicit, which are unconscious, so we are not aware of them. And they act out to protect us. One of these is denial. Okay, Daniel, how do you feel once Susie left your life? What do you mean, man? Susie didn't leave. She's just on vacation. And you go, Daniel, she's gone. She moved out. She's not coming back. Like, oh, no, of course she's coming back. Why would you say that? She just needs time to think, right? Because how do I stop? How do I not feel something that's bad? One way to go about it is I deny its existence. And I start distorting reality a little bit. Because if it's not true, then it doesn't matter. Right? If it's fiction, oh, whatever. Who cares? But when it becomes nonfiction, when it becomes reality, when it becomes very matter of fact, now I have to face it. And it's a lot harder to avoid those emotions. That's not to say that denial is the way to go, but I'm saying it's a normal, and it's actually a very logical response to a situation if you think about it. If the brain is trying to mitigate and defend itself from being overwhelmed by a plethora of emotions, denial is a way to kind of ease into confronting them rather than taking everything on at once. So now if you Google the 5 stages of grief, getting over the loss of a loved one, let's say, denial is the very first one. The defense mechanism that Sigmund Freud came up with all those years ago. How about another defense mechanism that I'm sure you've seen in movies? Guy goes to work, his employer yells at him. He comes home, he yells at his wife. Wife yells at the kids. Kids kick the dog. What's happening? Freud believed there was a defense mechanism which he called displacement. Displacement was when someone's giving you some sort of energy, typically negative, and it's unsafe to unload that same energy on the perpetrator. So then you express that on someone else. It's the idea of hurt people, or be careful, do not bleed on people who did not cut you. So what happens is, when that boss talks down to the man, he's thinking, look, I might be able to lose my job if I talk back to my supervisor. So instead, I'm going to go home and I'm going to talk back to my wife instead. I'm going to yell at her. Because in his mind, he perceives it to be less harmful and the safer option. The wife gets yelled at and goes, well, look, my husband just yelled at me. There's a good chance he might hit me. So I'm not going to yell back at him. He might leave me. I'm going to yell at my kids because that's like the safer option. And you can see how this continues. So displacement is another one of these defense mechanisms that our body, that our mind does, whether we are aware of it or not, in order to help, like I said, mitigate the damage. It's one thing to try to keep us as safe as possible. And unfortunately, when we're not aware of this stuff, we don't realize the other unintended consequences of this. Like what happens if we're in the denial stage for too long? What happens if we displace it so much to the point where a young girl who is shown hostility by her parents now acts very hostile towards everybody else, even though they don't deserve it, to a complete stranger who hasn't done anything to her. But she's carrying that anger and resentment that she has for her parents and is unloading on every single person that she sees. If she wasn't able to unload it on her parents. And even if she was able to, she might still be carrying that around. So it's extremely complex. If you're interested in this, type in Sigmund Freud defense mechanisms. To this day, I see it all the time. Whenever someone feels insecure, whenever someone is insulted about something. I saw a post, there was a gentleman talking about this lady's critique about something. It was something political. It was either a critique of her capitalistic views or I don't know what it was. But I remember the girl's response had nothing to do with the argument. She responded with something like hurry up and ask me out already. Like, I know you're obsessed with me. Hurry up and ask me out so I can reject you. Well, what does this tell us? Again, whenever you're in a situation and you think to yourself, I asked Rick about this incident and he got super defensive. Where is that coming from, my friends? Defensive, denial, displacement. These are all defense mechanisms that we first heard from Dr. Sigmund Freud, the psychologist from Vienna. So we see these things and they still have an impact to this day, and they're meant to protect us. They're meant to keep us safe from unwanted feelings. Unfortunately, it is a bad sign of character. Or it's not perfect, right? I'm sure you've seen people who are defensive. Like maybe when you saw them, you didn't think to yourself specifically, oh, this person's displacing. But as I'm talking about these subjects, I'm sure that you can think of situations where you've seen this. You're going, oh, so-and-so was just really stressed at this event. That's why he's really mad at his friend for doing blank, for bringing him Coke instead of a Sprite. The drinks are irrelevant. He's carrying that stress and that anger from his job. Freud also talked a lot about, let me talk about this other subject. He was so important. He was such an important voice for young people. And he said, look, the things that we do for young people, and this was later elaborated on by his daughter and by a woman, if I'm not mistaken, her name was Mary Ainsworth. Oh, I hope I'm saying that right. I believe Ainsworth is the correct name. Or if I'm not, it's going to be close to that. And it was this idea of, look, if you take a kid and you influence them and you impact them, that stuff sticks with them. This idea of time heals all wounds, like, no, it doesn't. That's why you have people who can get traumatized at the age of 12, 13, and then 20 years later, 10, 15 years later, it's not any better. It's still there. It still hurts. They haven't, quote unquote, moved on. It might not be as intense as it was, but thinking about it can still bring a tear to their eye. And he really thought about this idea. He goes, look, we really have to be careful, because what people do is when something sad happens, when something upsetting happens, people repress their memories. And he believed repression of memories was like, look, you're at a party, you get sexually harassed or sexually assaulted. So the brain goes, look, thinking about what happened, it's similar to denial. I have to acknowledge its existence, and if it exists, then it's real. And if it's real, that hurts and I'm really sad. So instead what you do is you just repress it. You push it down. You don't think about it. You don't think about it. Don't think about it. Don't think about what happened at the party. Don't think about what happened at the party, which is extremely hard to do. As you know, we have this boomerang effect. I say, don't think about a black bear. You first think about a black bear, and then you think, oh, he said don't. And then, it's actually tougher. So again, speaking on this idea of a lot of people who have bad memories, human instinct isn't to deal with them, which is what we do now in therapies. We do the opposite. We push it down. Who cares if I don't have a relationship with my father? I push it down. Who cares if my girlfriend left me? I push it down. That's the same advice that you see a bunch of these, I was going to say chads, but that's inappropriate. That a bunch of these young men are making to other young men. They go, look, your girlfriend left you? Hit the gym. Your father committed suicide? Hit the gym, walk it off. What's complaining going to do about it? Like, exactly. Freud said that our natural instinct is to repress those sad emotions, to pretend they don't exist and to look forward. The problem is they do exist. And what you're actually doing is you're taking a rain check on those feelings. You're saying, look, I feel horrific. I'm going to bury these. But what we might not recognize in the moment is that when you bury those troubling thoughts and those heavy emotions, is they don't go away. We just take a rain check on them. And we say, look, instead of dealing with this now, I'm going to carry this on my back like a bunch of heavy stones in a backpack. And I'm going to carry this around with me for the next couple of years. And that's what happens. That's what people do. And so Freud knew, he said, one of the cornerstones of therapy is we have to address the unconscious. He came up with this idea of free association, where you lie on the couch, you look up at the ceiling, you just start talking. The idea was, if I'm facing you and if we're talking, maybe there's a subtlety of, is Daniel judging me right now? What if I tell him I cheated on my girlfriend? What if I tell him I've had substance abuse problems? Is he going to look at me differently? And he didn't want that. He wanted people to be as authentic as possible. And in order to get to the unconscious, in order to get to those repressed memories and kind of pull them out from the deep underground, he had this idea of free association. Just talk. What comes to mind? What comes to mind when you think of your girlfriend? What comes to mind when you think of this? What do you think about how you handled the situation? And then you start peeling away at the layers. So free association was another huge one. This is one of the things, and this is the last thing I want to end off on. Freud got a lot of criticism about his idea of libido and sex and sexual energy. And he said, look, a lot of your life is driven by energy. Now, the interpretations are slightly different. The original, I think, has to do with sexual energy. My interpretation of it was this: from a basic organism, which could be, it could be an insect, it could be an animal, whatever. The idea is to reproduce, is to have a mate and to reproduce, right? This is true for almost any animal. Now, you take a step past that. He goes, look, and this is my interpretation of it, boys are secretly jealous of their fathers because they're in love with their mothers. And he said the same thing about girls. He said, look, girls are secretly jealous of their mothers because they're in love with their fathers. Now, the gross simplification is, oh, so you think boys want to marry their moms? It's like, maybe. Look, hear me out. When you have a young child, boy or girl, either or, and they're growing up, typically speaking, and this is, let's say the 1920s we're talking about, 1930s, where you have predominantly heterosexual couples, even though still most couples are heterosexual. LGBTQ, those guys, they're still the minority. When you have your first interaction with your mother, your first interaction with a female, okay, is, if it's a healthy one, if you're lucky, it's filled with love, kindness, compassion, patience, being gentle. So now that young boy connects, oh, females with kindness, compassion, gentleness, patience. That doesn't mean that men don't have that, but I think it's indisputable to claim that from a historical perspective, we've definitely focused on mothers having this more emotional, warm, kind feeling. So then, and again, daughters flipped over, the same exact thing. The daughter's first interaction, the first male in her life, when he shows aspects of confidence, protection, leadership, assertiveness, dependability, that's her father. So this idea of what a male is supposed to be, the role model is her dad. So now when she goes out, implicitly, I would make an argument, there's a good chance, if it's a healthy relationship with the parents, that she looks for someone like her father. Now, this doesn't mean someone who looks like her father. That's a gross simplification. This means, look, when you're a child and you're so impressionable and your role model idea is shaped by your father, when you go out and you meet a guy and you go on a first date, he pays for your dinner. just kind of how Dad used to pay when me and him used to go out. When he drops you off at home and he waits until you go in before he leaves, oh, that's kind of how what Dad used to do. Now, again, I don't think it's conscious. I don't think we sit there and go, oh, he's so much like my father. That's why I want to date him. No, not at all. But I think it's these implicit ideas that we've created about what a man should be, what a woman should be, what I expect from him. Again, these things are subject to change because of the times. We're in a place now where we're pushing women to be more assertive. We are, from a societal perspective, we're pushing men to be a little bit more gentle. But historically speaking, when you have them that are a little bit more traditional gender roles and you engrave that in the child, of course the boy who's now 19 years old has a girlfriend, and this girlfriend is super kind, the way mom was kind. And guess what? This new girlfriend, she likes to bake the same way mom liked to bake. That doesn't mean he's going out with that intention. But I promise you, it's these subtle things that it goes, I like this about her. I like this about her. I like this about her. That if you were to cross-examine his mother and his new girlfriend, they would have a lot of similarities. Now, there is no absolute. You're going to find people that, again, are going to be completely opposite. My understanding of it is exceptions do not make the rule. And I look at the averages. And I would say, on average, if a child has a good relationship with their parents, I would not be surprised if their partner showed a lot of the same traits and personality characteristics as their parents. Because like we said earlier, and this is all the ideas of Freud, when he said, look, that's the first impression that a mom makes on her kid, or that a father makes on their kid. And then we carry that in the back of our mind. So later on in our relationships, this is what we want. All right, folks, that's going to tie it up for the Sigmund appreciation video today. Thank you so much for listening on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts. I appreciate each and all of you. Take care, everybody. Stay safe.